Good morning, everyone. I'm Romanas Chesnaitis, and from ECHA, I'm working in evaluation, so I'm mainly dealing with environmental part of the dossiers and looking to both to hazard part of ecotoxicology, but also to exposure part of the registration dossiers. And I will be talking with going more to exposure assessment principles under like REACH. I go into some level of details how it's done or how it should be done for general chemicals and give you some insights on that. And I will go very quickly through legal requirements and a bit about use mapping, use description, and release assessment, release scenario. And mainly I will still concentrate probably on this release emission assessment part of exposure assessment. I won't go into details of state modeling, and I think we will be discussing it still later with some update needs, which will be presented in the afternoon today. That's the scheme which is known probably for everyone who is dealing with registrations under REACH. It's just a general concept of like information requirements and chemical safety assessment for each substances, about collection of data and hazard assessment and exposure assessment. And in principle, this exposure assessment or CSR is not required for all substances. There are some legal requirements, then it's needed and then it's not. And as a basic principle for substances with low tonnage, which still needs to be registered, there is no need for chemical safety report to be provided, meaning also no need for more detailed exposure assessment and risk assessment under REACH. When exposure assessment is needed, in principle it's needed for higher tonnage substances, then there are some hazards identified and it needs to cover all life cycle stages of the substance, including manufacturing and also waste disposal, waste handling part, and it needs to address all hazards identified. That's the really an important point which we, from our evaluation at least point of view, we see quite often that not all hazards are identified, and sometimes there is a discussion between whether it's only classifiable or not, but it's all hazards, not only classifiable hazards to be identified. And it's given also in REACH legislation and explained in our guidance about those main steps of exposure assessment: mapping of uses, description of uses, generation of exposure scenarios where information on operational conditions and risk management measures about use of substance needs to be provided. And the main steps we are talking here is an exposure estimation, which includes emission estimation, assessment of chemical phase and pathways, modeling of fate of substances in the environment, and estimation of exposure levels, which was said before in this presentation, to be compared with PNEC levels, no effect concentration. And it should be iterative process under REACH, so if risk is indicated, there is a possibility either to improve information on hazard side, providing more data on hazards of the substance, more testing, or improve handling of the substance, so improve the management of the substance, so decrease in exposure levels of the substance. And REACH also specifies what are protection targets in general, so those are aquatic, terrestrial compartment, atmospheric compartment, accumulation via food chains, and also microbiological activity in STPs. And also, I put here mainly environment, where exposure information comes from environmental exposure assessment, while the hazard part, it comes from human health toxicity data information. So, but for that discussion, it's relevant because we talk about the exposure part here. We have a number of guidances. I won't go into any details of those, but the main guidance is Chapter R16 on environmental exposure assessment. And in principle, the approach and methodology described there is following EUSES like system as such. So it's a basic what we have for each industrial chemicals. Just very briefly about use mapping. It's a core for further exposure assessment. It's indeed an identification of all uses which substance is used for, of all life cycles of the substance, and description of those uses to further to perform that safety assessment, including an exposure assessment. And all life cycles should be addressed of the substance. And what we mean by use description, I put here very briefly that use name and further description of the use and identifiers of those uses, substances used in some articles and what sectors it's used, and assigning a relevant environmental release category and process category. So, and for that, there is a system of use maps where we have downstream user sector organizations which could present their uses and the conditions of use of chemicals in their sector in harmonized and structured way, so that there is information available for all registrants who are producing substances or importing substances for uses within those sectors. That it could be the input parameters for their exposure assessments for human health and also environment would be harmonized, and they could reflect the real use of the substance within those sectors. And we have use maps library where we hope that more and more downstream user sectors will provide their information and those use maps, so it could be also easy for authorities to follow those, let's say, harmonized and structured assessments later on a dossier level, on a substance level, and also it's much of help, in my view, for registrants, as I say, of specific chemicals used within those sectors. And those use maps are library is available at our ECHA website. Now coming to exposure assessment, as I mentioned, there are three steps in general of exposure assessment, but just before coming to those steps, just to mention that in principle an exposure assessment under ECHA is done on two spatial scales, on local and regional scale, and local scale it just assumes the vicinity of the release source, so close to the point of release of exposure, and regional scale includes all release sources in that area. And in both cases, it's standardized either local scale or regional region, which are assumed behind that modeling and exposure assessment. And for how it's split, it's differentiated between industrial sites and uses at industrial sites, where you have normally an emission release from point source and widespread use. And there are different life cycle stages could be assigned for industrial and widespread uses. For local scale and industrial sites, in principle, there is a generic possibility of the assessment, which is available in EUSES also, or it could be site-specific assessment. If more information is available, quite a number of values still can be overwritten. It's not everything can be overwritten, but some of values still can be. And as it was mentioned, we have a tool, ECHA, which will be presented later, and there are some defaults which you cannot override for regulatory purposes in our view, but some still site-specific information can be used, and your assessment could be reiterated and refined. And for widespread use, in principle, the release to water is assumed to be collected also in one sewage system, in one public system, and that's why a release at the end is assumed as a point source from that sewage treatment plant. So it's also kind of comparable at the end as a release to water to the point source of industrial. And regional scales, I don't go into any details, but in principle, all releases within the area and region are taken into account for further estimation. It's wrong direction. And now coming to the first step of that assessment. It's an emission assessment, estimation, and the aim of this release emission estimation is to calculate the release rates, which are like factors driven by release factors and tonnage. And in principle, release factors are just a fraction of used amount being released via some specific route of exposure, and a tonnage is a different type of tonnages which could be used for this release rate, depending whether it's a local scale, whether it's regional scale, whether it's for widespread use or for industrial use. So there are some rules, and I will talk a bit later, but in principle, the release rates are based on release factors and tonnages. And here for about tonnages, you can see just a short summary what type of tonnages could be needed for exposure assessment and for this release estimation in particular, that it starts from a tonnage per use per year for the substance, and it goes later what distributed is for uses at industrial site, for widespread uses, and also there are some rules how regional assessment and regional tonnages are calculated, and at the end of the day you have very different release rates which are needed for to calculate predicted environmental concentrations in different compartments and for different protection targets. Because for each protection target you need of predicted environmental concentration versus effect concentration. So we will have at the end of the day local daily release rate based on daily use amount at the site, and local annual release rate based on annual use amount, and so on, with widespread uses and for regional assessment. So there is a number of regional release rates and local release rates are calculated by the tool, or should be calculated if the tool is not used for predicted environmental concentrations. And release factors, another part of the equation, it's in principle, ideally, probably it should be just a measured values of release to various compartments, but of course it's not possible to have measured values for each of releases. So there are default release factors which are given in this guidance R16, and it's given for each of environmental release category, which is a descriptor used to describe uses, and in principle it assumes those factors and those categories assume that there are no any risk management measures are behind, and they are therefore very conservative, and in some cases they even it's not mass balance based factors also, and they can be above 100% of the substance which is used. So, but they are conservative, and it's really a tier 1 or even tier 0 assessment for your chemical safety assessment of the substance. And but there are more specific, if there is more specific information available, those release factors can be refined, and there are some options for this refinement. Those I will be talking about specific ERGs, so-called SPERGs, bit more into details in next slide, and also it can be site-specific information, some measured information available for some sites or for some industries. Also, OECD emission scenario documents could be used, and best available techniques information. Just as it default in our guidance, it's mentioned that A and B tables information from TGB is not acceptable as such without a further justification. So we would expect to see more information and justification provided and linking those specific information from those tables with some specific conditions of use for the substance and for the company which uses those for their assessment. And now about those perks, as I mentioned, it's sector-specific environmental release categories, and basically they would provide information on release factors which are relevant for that specific sector. And it was an analysis of industry done back in 2008 about those conservative release categories and factors given in our guidance. And it was concluded by the industry that in principle the safe use is proven in very rare cases because, as I mentioned, they are really conservative. But they are useful in principle just for describing substances and maybe categorizing them in some groups and categories. But it was concluded that in principle, industry sectors need to develop their specific, more refined and justified release factors for bit higher tier assessment, which is still low tier assessment in general picture, but which would ensure at least or would justify a safe use of more than 10% of substances, but would bring it to 90% by assessment of the industry. So, and only for rest of 10% of the substance, it would need still further refinement be done with really more specific information on the hazards and exposure for those substances would be needed. So in 2014, ECHA commissioned a project to some colleagues from RIVM basically, and also consultants from OCOPO, and it was an assessment of reliability of STIRCs, what information currently is in STIRCs and how it should be justified, the release factors from STIRCs and information, other information provided in STIRCs. And it was developed within a project some template for how the information, how and what type of information on STIRCs should be provided and in which type of documentation to really that both authorities and users of those STIRCs could benefit and get clear information, what is the basis for different values provided and what should be communicated to downstream users to ensure that it's clear and they are able to implement those conditions of use or risk management which is necessary to ensure safe use of the substance. And in principle, it was two types of documents, let's say, flagged that should be available for those STIRCs. It's fact sheets which would bring just a summary of key information necessary for producing a chemical safety assessment and reporting those assessments in chemical safety report, and also developing extended exposure scenarios which needs to be attached to safety data sheet, and more content, document containing more content. It would be a background document which would go into more details of processes and assumptions, what is covered by that fact sheet, by that specific STIRC and fact sheet information provided there. And all justifications and more detailed information would be provided in that background document. There is expert network on exposure scenarios, which have regular meetings where industry and authorities are present. And one of the groups within that network is dealing with those perks, and it's led by industry. And in principle, there is an objective of that group to increase the quality of existing perks, because by previous assessments of quality done within different projects, it was concluded that there is still missing pieces of explanation how those values and information was derived and how it's representative for different sectors. So that group is trying to work on different inputs to increase quality of those existing perks, and for that year it was an idea to develop a spur quality criteria and review by industry of existing spurs. And also ECHA and member states as authorities are invited to provide their comments on the quality criteria developed by that group. So it's ongoing. It's not finished, but there are developments on those quality criteria and then process how this quality would be reviewed on different spurs. Now about coming back to tonnage estimation, at least for local release. As I mentioned, it's two different scenarios for industrial settings and widespread uses. And for industrial settings, in principle, as guidance advises, unless there is a more specific information is available, that whole tonnage of the substance assigned for that use should be used in estimating the release rate. But as I mentioned, it can be overwritten if it's more knowledge available for that resistance, for that use, and it's justified. And also, on the basis of those tonnages, there are some default parameters for exposure assessment are given in our guidance, and it's also in relation of release days or use days. What would be a default parameters for different life cycle stages on a basis of tonnages used of the substance for specific use are given. So if there are no better information, justified information, in principle, default setting would apply, which is quite conservative, but without better knowledge, those we expect to be used. And for wide dispersive uses, it's also, there are some default assumptions about the region, what the region is about, and some factors are used to estimate an annual tonnage and later daily use in a standard town. And in principle, for a region, it's assumed that 10% of the fraction used are used within a region of the substance which is assigned for that specific use, and in standard town, it's assumed that it's 2,000 times less than by number of inhabitants comparing to the regional inhabitants, and also some additional safety factor for geographical or temporal peaks is assigned. So in principle, there is a formula to calculate and some constant to estimate release rate and more specifically daily use in a standard town. And basically, not going into much details on what type of release scenarios are available in EUSES, at least for REACH. From REACH perspective, it's in general one release scenario is VASTP is available with some assumptions behind and some processes taken into account. And as I mentioned, also the picture reflects like industrial use, which releases to STP, and later there is an application of sludge from STP and release to water after STP, but in general, the similar scenario applies for wide dispersive uses also, where substances assumed also, at least the releases to water, are assumed to be collected via municipal sewage treatment plant system and again redistributed where application of STP sludge to soil and release to water. So in general, we talk about one general scenario which is available now. And it will be some discussions further on among some update needs about expanding availability of other different scenarios in EUSES for easy estimation if substance is used in a different way than described here. And here it's very basic slide. I said that I don't go into any state modeling details, as we agreed that I would not be presenting it in any further details. It's just to reflect that one substance is like released, there is different processes in environment how taken and calculated, and some default assumptions made for local scenarios versus regional estimations, and those processes are calculated within some box, within model. There are different models for local scenarios and for regional scenario, and some processes are taken into account, some not, and it will be also, I think, a discussion whether EUSES should be improved, but I would follow the suggestion made or conclusion made by Dick in his presentation. The simple is better, so it's a part of discussion. What is reality versus simplicity, and how, for regulatory purposes at least, modeling and exposure assessment needs to cover within Europe different regions, different parts, and so it's many considerations behind what default low tier assessment, as we talk about EUSES, needs to do for that level of assessment. And again, just to mention that there is a number of those protection targets, and for each of them we have some predicted mode of concentrations calculated, and the similar way for each of them we need to have predicted environmental concentrations calculated, and that's what EUSES does for each of that protection target, and for each PNEC we get some predicted environmental concentration calculated, which are compared, and the conclusion can be made at least whether safety on that tier of assessment is reached, or there is a further refinement of either hazard or exposure assessment is necessary. And we acknowledge as ECHA also, and that's a part of discussions here, that there are many limitations of this modeling approach available in our guidance and in EUSES. Number of substances and number of scenarios are not covered, so that's a part to discuss what should be extended and what should be included in a further EUSES versions, whether more scenarios and more substances, or it's not feasible to do. So it's part of discussion. And I think with that I would like to end my presentation.